The disinfectant hit her nostrils first, chemical and sharp. Nothing like the stench she'd grown accustomed to during the 8-week journey across the Atlantic in the cargo hold of a military transport ship. Greta Hoffman couldn't stop her hands from shaking as she stood in the intake room at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, that September morning in 1945. Everything inside her screamed that this was the calm before the storm, the moment of false security before the interrogators arrived with their instruments and their questions and their absolute certainty that she deserved whatever came next. She'd been trained to expect brutality. The party had been very clear about what happened to soldiers who fell into enemy hands. There would be beatings, certainly. Starvation, probably. Things worse than death, almost definitely. That's what the Americans did to prisoners, they'd been told. That's what everyone did to prisoners. It was the natural order of war. Then a guard approached, a woman with dark hair and tired eyes, holding a bundle of folded clothing. The guard didn't speak German, but her gestures were clear enough. She pointed to the clothes, then to a door marked with a sign Greta couldn't read, then made a motion like washing. Greta took the clothes with trembling fingers. They were real garments, not the threadbare rags she'd expected. Cotton, wool, fabric that hadn't been recycled 3 times over. Another guard, this one younger with a name tag that read something starting with M, opened the shower room door and said something in English. Then, switching to heavily accented German, she added the only words that mattered. "The water is hot. You have 5 minutes. Make yourself clean." Greta stepped through the doorway expecting a trick, a trap, cold water or something worse. But when she turned the ancient-looking knob, warm water sputtered out, then steadied into a consistent stream. Not scalding, not freezing, just warm. Her legs gave out. She caught herself against the tile wall and stayed there, forehead pressed to the cold ceramic, while water that couldn't possibly be real ran down her back and shoulders and through her filthy, matted hair. She hadn't been properly cleaned since July. The transport ship had offered only cold seawater and a single rough cloth shared among 30 women. Before that, the holding facility outside Bremen had provided buckets and rationed water that ran out before everyone could wash. Before that was a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The soap sat in a metal dish bolted to the wall. She picked it up, half expecting it to be a cruel joke, a bar of wood painted white. But it lathered. It actually lathered. The scent was something floral she couldn't quite place, artificial but not unpleasant, the kind of thing her mother used to buy in peacetime from the little shop on Hohestrasse before everything changed. Greta scrubbed her arms, her legs, her face, watching brown water circle the drain. 8 weeks of grime, of fear, of certainty that she was going to die in some basement with a bullet in her skull. All of it washing away down an American drain in an Iowa prison camp that smelled like disinfectant instead of death. When she emerged, someone had left a towel, an actual towel, thick and white and clean. She dried herself slowly, methodically, trying to understand the shape of this new reality. The clothes fit reasonably well. Someone had thought about sizes. Someone had cared enough to ensure that the trousers wouldn't fall down, that the shirt wouldn't hang like a sack. There were undergarments that had been boiled white, socks without holes, and a cardigan with only one missing button. The attention to detail felt obscene. These were enemy soldiers who'd done this. The people her country had tried to destroy. The people who'd firebombed Dresden and Cologne and Hamburg. The people who should, by all rights, hate her enough to let her rot. The guard with the German accent, the one whose name tag read Ruth, led her down a corridor that smelled like floor wax and coffee. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute they'd been drinking for years. The barracks building was long and wooden, painted white with green trim, surrounded by barbed wire that somehow looked less menacing than it should have. Inside, rows of metal cots stretched the length of the room, 30 beds, maybe more. Women sat or lay on them in various states of shock and confusion. Some were crying quietly. Others stared at the ceiling with expressions that suggested they'd travelled far beyond the reach of comfort. One older woman with grey-streaked hair and a face like carved stone looked up as Greta entered. Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "They're fattening us up before the execution," the woman said in German, her Bavarian accent thick. "This is psychological warfare. Make us comfortable, make us hope, then take it all away. That's when the real interrogation starts. The Russians do it too. I've heard stories." Greta found an empty cot near a window that looked out over a yard where American soldiers walked with the casual confidence of people who'd won. She sat down on the mattress. It was thin, but it was there. A real mattress with stuffing inside, not just boards with a blanket thrown over them. At the foot of the bed sat a folded wool blanket, grey and scratchy-looking, but clean. She checked it twice for lice, running her fingers along the seams. Nothing. When was the last time she'd slept under a blanket without lice? 2 years? 3? That evening, guards wheeled in carts loaded with metal trays. The smell hit Greta before she could see the food. Something warm. Something that had been cooked recently. The tray that was placed in front of her cot held a bowl of soup with visible chunks of potato swimming in brownish liquid. There was dark bread, not sawdust extended, but actual bread with a real crust. A small portion of margarine sat in a paper cup. And coffee. The coffee smelled like coffee. Greta stared at her tray and didn't move. This had to be poisoned. This had to be the trick. They'd given her soap and clean clothes and a mattress, and now they'd poison her with contaminated food while she was too grateful and too exhausted to resist. Ruth appeared beside her cot like she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "You think it's poisoned," she said in German. It wasn't a question. Greta met her eyes. "Isn't it?" Ruth picked up the spoon, dipped it into Greta's soup, and ate a generous mouthful. She swallowed deliberately, then set the spoon down. "Listen carefully," she said. "You're worth more to us alive than dead. We need you for processing. Records, interrogations, repatriation paperwork. Dead prisoners are just forms nobody wants to fill out. So we feed you. We keep you healthy enough to be useful. It's not kindness, it's logistics. Understand?" The explanation was cold and transactional and therefore completely believable. Greta picked up the spoon and ate. The soup was bland but warm. The potatoes were real, soft enough to mash against the roof of her mouth. The bread was heavy and dense but substantial in a way she'd almost forgotten food could be. Her stomach, shrunken from months of inadequate rations, cramped painfully around the sudden influx of nutrition. She ate anyway, forcing herself to swallow despite the discomfort. Across the barracks, a young woman with blonde hair cut short like a boy's watched Greta with unconcealed contempt. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, with the kind of hollow-eyed certainty that came from believing absolutely in something that had turned out to be a lie. She muttered something in German that Greta pretended not to hear. Traitor. Eating their charity like a dog begging for scraps. We should refuse. We should show them we can't be broken. Greta finished her soup, set the tray on the floor beside her cot and lay down. The blanket was scratchy against her skin, but it was warm. Through the window, she could see the September sky turning from blue to violet to deep purple as the sun set somewhere beyond the buildings and the fence and the cornfields that stretched toward a horizon she couldn't see. Iowa. She was in Iowa, in America, in the country that had firebombed her city and killed her fiancé and won the war so completely that she was now lying in an enemy prison camp, fed and clean and utterly, completely lost. She thought about Karl, who'd died at Stalingrad 3 years ago in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He used to recite Rilke before bed, back when they were engaged and planning a future that seemed inevitable. His favourite was Autumn Day. Lord, it is time. The summer was immense. He'd whisper it against her hair while they lay together in his small apartment with the blackout curtains drawn. Who has no house now will never have one. Who is alone will stay alone. She'd believed that once, believed in the words, believed in the righteousness of their cause, believed in the necessity of sacrifice and the inevitability of victory. Now she lay in an enemy prison camp with a full stomach and clean clothes, and she'd never felt more alone. Her body was safe, her mind was unraveling. And the worst part, the part that made her want to scream or vomit or both, was the tiny, treacherous flicker of hope that had lodged itself somewhere in her chest. Maybe she would survive this. Maybe she would go home. Maybe there was still something, anything, left to go back to. Maybe that was the cruelest torture of all, not the physical pain she'd been expecting, but this terrible, impossible hope that refused to die even when it should have. The days began to form a pattern. Wake at 6 when the bell rang. Breakfast in the mess hall, usually oatmeal with powdered milk and sometimes raisins. Work details assigned after morning roll call, lunch at noon, recreation time in the afternoon, dinner at 6, lights out at 10. The predictability was its own kind of mercy after months of chaos and uncertainty. Greta moved through the routine like a woman underwater, present but not really there, going through the motions because the alternative was to stop moving entirely. 2 weeks into her captivity, Ruth found her during morning roll call and pulled her aside. "Hoffman, you studied literature before the war, correct?" Greta nodded, surprised that anyone knew this about her, surprised that it mattered. "How did you—" "Your intake file. You attended the University of Cologne for 3 years before you were assigned to the Signals Corps. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Good. You're being reassigned to library duty. Report to Building C after breakfast. You'll be responsible for reshelving books and maintaining inventory. The work isn't difficult, but it requires attention to detail. Can you handle that?" Greta nodded again, not trusting her voice. The library occupied a small room at the back of the administrative building, tucked between the commandant's office and what appeared to be a storage closet. The space couldn't have been more than 20 feet square, but 3 of the walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelves holding perhaps 200 volumes. Most were in German, donations from the Red Cross or seized from German ships or collected from who knows where. Novels by Mann and Hesse and Remarque, poetry by Rilke and Goethe, technical manuals, a few religious texts. But there was also a small section of American magazines, glossy publications with names like Life and National Geographic and the Saturday Evening Post. A handwritten sign in English and German warned that these were for reference only and were not to be removed from the library. Greta started with the German books, organizing them alphabetically by author, then by title within each author's section. The work was methodical and soothing in a way she hadn't anticipated. Her hands remembered how to handle books with care, supporting the spines, turning pages gently. It was the first time since her capture that she'd been trusted with something fragile, something that could be damaged by carelessness or malice. She worked slowly, carefully, losing herself in the familiar task. During her lunch break, curiosity got the better of her. She pulled out a copy of Life magazine from June and flipped through its pages with trembling fingers. The photographs were impossibly vivid after years of grey newsprint and propaganda images. There were pictures of American soldiers landing on beaches she didn't recognize, scenes of celebration in London and Paris, advertisements for Coca-Cola and Lucky Strike cigarettes and washing machines, showing a world where such luxuries still existed. And then, toward the middle of the magazine, a spread of photographs that made her breath catch in her throat. Bombed German cities. Cologne, reduced to skeletal ruins with only the cathedral still standing amid the rubble. Dresden, entirely flattened, neighborhoods that had stood for centuries now, just piles of stone and ash. Hamburg with its streets full of debris and its buildings hollow. These were her cities, her country, photographed from above like autopsy images of a corpse. She wanted to look away but couldn't. This was what defeat looked like. This was what losing meant. But then she turned the page and found something else. Photographs of American military cemeteries in France. row after row after row of white crosses stretching toward the horizon. Thousands of them, tens of thousands. Young men with names and hometowns carved into stone. John Miller, Ohio; Robert Thompson, Texas; Michael O'Brien, New York. The graves went on forever. Both sides had bled. Both sides had buried their sons. Both sides had mothers who would never stop grieving. The realization settled over her like a weight she couldn't shake off. "Finding anything interesting?" Ruth's voice came from the doorway. Greta looked up, startled. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Ruth stood there holding 2 cups of coffee, steam rising from both. "I didn't ask for coffee," Greta said carefully. "I know." Ruth crossed the room and set 1 cup on the small desk beside Greta. "I brought it anyway. You looked like you needed it." She pulled up a chair and sat down, which had to violate about 6 different regulations. Fraternization between guards and prisoners was explicitly forbidden. Greta had seen the rules posted in German and English throughout the camp. But Ruth sat anyway, her expression unreadable. Greta wrapped both hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into her palms. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you kind to me?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried an edge of something Greta couldn't quite identify. "My grandmother taught me to read in German, fairy tales mostly, Grimm, Andersen. She came over from Prussia in 1889 with nothing but a trunk and a prayer book, worked in a laundry for 12 hours a day until her hands bled, sent money back to her family until they could come over too, built a life here." She paused, staring at her own coffee. "She died last year. Never stopped speaking German, even when the neighbors gave her hell for it during both wars. Used to tell me that hate was easy, that any fool could hate. That the hard thing was remembering that people were people, even when they'd done terrible things." Greta didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy with things neither of them could quite articulate. "What were you looking at?" Ruth nodded toward the magazine spread across Greta's lap. "Before I interrupted, the cemeteries. In France." Ruth's expression hardened slightly, a muscle tightening in her jaw. "My brother's buried there. Omaha Beach. He was 22 years old, made it through D-Day, survived for 3 weeks, got hit by a sniper while trying to help another soldier who was wounded." The words landed like stones between them. Greta set her coffee down carefully, her hands suddenly unsteady. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Yeah." Ruth stood abruptly, as if regretting the intimacy of the conversation. "Me too." She headed for the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. "Get back to work, Hoffman. Those books won't shelve themselves." But the next afternoon, Ruth returned during Greta's shift. This time she didn't hover by the door. She walked straight to the poetry section and ran her fingers along the spines like she was looking for something specific. She pulled out a slim volume, its cover worn soft with age, and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Herbstag," Ruth said softly, reading the title. "Autumn Day." My Oma used to recite this one, said it reminded her of Prussia in September, when the light turned golden and you could smell winter coming. Greta's breath caught. That was Karl's favourite poem. The poem he'd whispered to her the night before he left for the Eastern Front, holding her close in his tiny apartment while bombs fell somewhere in the distance. The poem that had followed her through the war like a ghost. "Lord, it is time," Ruth began in halting but grammatically correct German. The summer was immense. "Lay your shadow on the sundials," Greta continued without thinking, the words coming automatically. "And on the meadows let the winds go loose." Ruth looked up, surprised. Then, after a moment, she smiled slightly and continued. "Bid the last fruits to be full. Give them just 2 more southerly days, press them into fulfillment and chase the final sweetness into the heavy wine. For a moment, they were not guard and prisoner. Not American and German, not victor and vanquished. Just two women holding on to something beautiful in a world that had tried very hard to destroy beauty entirely. The moment stretched between them, fragile and impossible. "He used to recite it," Greta said quietly, her voice cracking. "My fiancé, Karl. Before Stalingrad, before everything." Ruth closed the book gently and slid it back onto the shelf. Her expression had softened, the hard edge gone. "I'm sorry," she said. And this time her voice carried no professional distance, just the plain, terrible weight of shared loss. After Ruth left, Greta sat alone in the library for a long time, surrounded by books that had survived the war when so many people hadn't. The smell of old paper and ink filled the room, neutral and safe, a smell that existed outside of politics and nationality and all the things that divided people into categories of us and them. She thought about Ruth's grandmother, who had fled poverty in Prussia and found a new life in a country that eventually sent her grandson to die liberating the land she'd left behind. She thought about Karl, who had believed in victory right up until the moment a Russian bullet found him in the frozen hell of Stalingrad. She thought about herself, sitting in an enemy prison camp, drinking coffee and discussing poetry with a woman whose brother she might have inadvertently helped kill through her work at the radar station. The contradictions were unbearable, the guilt was crushing. And yet, somehow, impossibly, she was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling something other than despair or rage or the numb acceptance she'd cultivated like armor. It wasn't forgiveness. She didn't deserve forgiveness, and Ruth certainly wasn't offering it. But it was something, a crack in the wall, a sliver of light in what had been total darkness. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be enough. December arrived with snow that transformed the camp into something almost peaceful, almost beautiful. 3 months had passed since Greta's arrival, and the rhythms of captivity had become routine in a way that felt both comforting and deeply wrong. Should she be comfortable here? Should she be settling into this new life while her country lay in ruins and her family's fate remained unknown? The questions circled endlessly, but she had no answers. The camp commander, a woman named Colonel Hayes, who spoke German with a Bavarian accent that suggested she'd spent time there before the war, made an announcement during morning roll call in mid-December. The prisoners, she explained in her careful, formal German, would be permitted to organize a modest Christmas celebration. There would be extra rations, a tree, time for singing and observance. The news spread through the barracks like electricity, met with reactions that ranged from quiet joy to suspicious hostility. That young blonde woman, the one who'd called Greta a traitor for eating the soup that first night, spat on the floor when she heard. Her name was Lisa Brandt, Greta had learned, and she was from Munich. "Christmas with the enemy," Lisa announced loudly in German. "Celebrating while our fatherland burns. Disgusting. Anyone who participates is a collaborator." But most of the women were grateful for any break in the monotony, any reminder that they were still human beings capable of marking time with something other than suffering. Inga, the older Bavarian woman who'd warned about fattening them up for execution, surprised everyone by volunteering to help coordinate the preparations. She'd worked in a bakery before the war, she explained, and still remembered how to make passable stolen-style bread if they could get the ingredients. The camp's kitchen actually provided what they needed: flour, yeast, a precious portion of butter and sugar, dried fruit that had been soaking in something that smelled vaguely alcoholic. Inga stood in the communal kitchen examining these ingredients with something like wonder on her weathered face. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "waste not, want not." The days leading up to Christmas became a flurry of activity that felt both absurd and necessary. Women folded paper into snowflakes using techniques they remembered from childhood, before the war had taught them to forget such frivolous things. Someone fashioned a star from tin foil salvaged from cigarette packages. A young farm girl named Hilda Schaefer, who had restless hands and a talent for detail work, spent hours in the kitchen helping Inga prepare the bread. The barracks began to smell of cinnamon and cardamom and anticipation. Greta threw herself into the preparations with something approaching desperation. She lettered Christmas greetings in careful script on scraps of paper, decorated the edges with simple drawings of stars and evergreen branches. It felt absurd, celebrating the birth of Christ in a prison camp in enemy territory, a world away from everything she'd known. But the absurdity was also a kind of grace. They were still alive, still capable of marking time with something other than pain. Still able to remember, however faintly, that they had once been people who celebrated holidays and sang songs and believed in things beyond mere survival. Christmas Eve arrived cold and clear, the sky that particular shade of blue that only happens in deep winter. The barracks had been transformed. Paper snowflakes hung from the rafters, catching the lamplight and casting dancing shadows. A small tree stood in the corner, its branches decorated with bits of coloured paper and scraps of ribbon donated by guards who probably shouldn't have been fraternizing. Someone had managed to produce a harmonica, and the first notes of Stille Nacht drifted through the room just after dinner. Greta sang quietly at first, self-conscious, but then louder as other voices joined. The German words filled her mouth like a prayer she'd forgotten she knew. Silent night, holy night. All is calm, all is bright. Around her, other voices joined in, some strong and clear, others wavering and uncertain, some choked with tears they were trying to hide. Even the guards stationed at the door didn't intervene. One of them, a young Mexican-American woman named Lou Martinez, who'd been teaching Greta basic English phrases, hummed along softly. Then Ruth stepped forward from her post near the door. Her eyes were wet, Greta noticed. Wet but not crying, like she was fighting to keep the tears contained. In careful, heavily accented German, she began to sing the second verse. Her voice cracked on the high notes, and her pronunciation was imperfect, but she didn't stop. She sang the whole verse through while 30 German prisoners and half a dozen American guards stood in stunned silence. Greta felt something break open in her chest, something that had been sealed tight for months or maybe years. This was what they'd been told didn't exist. Mercy, fairness, the possibility of humanity in the midst of war. This was what the propaganda had insisted was weakness, decadence, a lie told by soft nations doomed to fall. But here it was, real, tangible. A German Christmas song sung in harmony by women on opposite sides of a war that had cost millions upon millions of lives. For the first time since her capture, Greta allowed herself to feel something like gratitude. Not for the war, not for the defeat, not for any of the terrible things that had brought her here, but for this moment, for the possibility that maybe, somehow, she could go home one day and help rebuild. Not the Germany that was, not the regime that had promised glory and delivered only ashes, but something different, something better, something worth the sacrifice of all those white crosses in the French cemeteries. Maybe she could spend the rest of her life trying to deserve this moment. Maybe that would be enough. The song ended. There was silence, broken only by quiet weeping and the shuffle of feet. The peace felt fragile but real. Then Lisa Brandt stood up from her cot in the back corner, her face flushed, her eyes bright with something that looked like fever or fanaticism, or both. Die Fahne hoch, she sang out, sharp and defiant, shattering the fragile peace like a hammer through glass. The anthem, the forbidden song. The song they'd been explicitly told never to sing. Her voice rang through the barracks. We are not defeated. We are prisoners of war, not charity cases, not dogs begging for scraps from our conqueror's table. Several women looked away, ashamed or frightened or both. But a few, maybe 3 or 4, joined her quietly. Their voices were thin but present, defiant in the face of overwhelming defeat. Ruth moved fast, crossing the room in 3 strides. Shut it down. Now. Her voice carried absolute authority. Lisa turned to face her, chin raised in challenge. Then, deliberately, she spat at Ruth's feet. "Traitor," she said in German. "German blood-serving American masters. Whore." The words hung in the air like poison. 2 other guards moved in immediately, flanking Lisa. Colonel Hayes appeared in the doorway, her face grave and hard. "Take her to isolation," she said in English, then repeated it in German. "The celebration is over. Everyone back to your bunks. Now." The tree was removed that night by guards working in grim silence. The extra rations that had been promised for Christmas Day were confiscated as punishment. The paper snowflakes stayed up because no one could be bothered to take them down. But they looked different now. Foolish, childish. A dream that had died before it could fully form. Greta lay on her cot that night, staring at the ceiling, while around her women wept or cursed or sat in stony silence. The barracks had fractured. There were those like Greta who had begun to accept the unacceptable truth that maybe, just maybe, they'd been wrong about everything. And there were those like Lisa who would die before admitting defeat, who would carry their convictions like weapons until the very end. The distance between these 2 camps was unbridgeable. No amount of kindness could cross it. No amount of evidence could penetrate it. They were living in the same physical space, but inhabiting completely different realities. Greta closed her eyes and tried to remember the feeling of singing in harmony, of that brief moment when it had felt like maybe reconciliation was possible, maybe healing could happen, maybe the world could be rebuilt. But all she could hear was Lisa's voice, shrill and unrepentant, echoing in the darkness. All is calm, all is bright. The lie of Christmas, the false promise of peace on earth. January brought news that arrived in waves, each one colder and more devastating than the last. The first wave came in the form of a mandatory assembly. Every prisoner was required to attend. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the camp's small recreation hall, her expression carefully neutral, her voice flat and professional. "As part of your processing and eventual repatriation preparation," she explained in German, "you will be shown documentary evidence from the Nuremberg trials currently underway. This is not punishment. This is not propaganda. This is education. You have a right to know what was done in your country's name, by your government, with the support or at least the passive acceptance of your people." The projector flickered to life in the darkened hall. Greta sat between Hilda and Inga, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her fingernails drew blood from her palms. The first images were familiar enough. Military tribunals, men in suits speaking into microphones, prosecutors presenting evidence. Then the footage changed. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, Treblinka, names that would haunt history. Mountains of emaciated bodies stacked like cordwood. Living skeletons with hollow eyes staring at cameras with expressions beyond horror or fear or anything human. Children with numbers tattooed on their skeletal arms. Mass graves being bulldozed closed because there was no other way to manage the sheer volume of the dead. Gas chambers disguised as showers. Ovens. Industrial equipment designed specifically, methodically, efficiently, for the purpose of exterminating human beings by the thousands, by the millions. The projector's mechanical whir was the only sound in the room beyond the occasional gasp or stifled sob. Greta stopped breathing. Her vision tunneled until all she could see was the screen, the images, the irrefutable evidence of atrocity on a scale she couldn't comprehend. She had known about camps. Everyone had known about camps. Dachau had been public knowledge since the early days. Work camps, they'd been told. Detention centers for political prisoners, communists, troublemakers, people who refused to follow the new order. Harsh, yes. Brutal, probably. But necessary for national security. But this was not harsh. This was not detention. This was extermination, industrial murder, planned, methodical, efficient. The Reich that promised glory and greatness had built factories for killing human beings, and she had supported it. She had believed in it. She had worked at her radar station directing fighters and helping coordinate defenses while trains rolled past in the night carrying people to their deaths. Behind her, someone whispered frantically in German, "We didn't know. We couldn't have known. This is propaganda. It has to be propaganda." But Greta remembered. She remembered the trains that passed her station at night, heading east, always east. Cattle cars packed so tightly that sometimes, if the wind was right and you were working the late shift, you could hear sounds from inside. Human sounds. She remembered the rumours everyone called British propaganda. Too grotesque to be real. Too evil to be possible. She remembered the way her neighbour Frau Goldstein had disappeared one morning in 1942 and no one had asked where she'd gone. She remembered the unspoken agreement among everyone she knew not to ask certain questions, not to look too closely, not to think too hard about where all those people were going. We didn't want to know, she thought, and the realization was devastating in its simplicity. We could have known if we'd wanted to. We chose not to ask. The lights came back on. Colonel Hayes stood at the front of the room, her face expressionless. "You will have time to process what you've seen," she said. "Chaplains are available if you need to talk. Religious services will be offered in both German and English. You are dismissed." Greta walked back to the barracks in silence, her legs moving automatically, her mind somewhere else entirely. Inside the barracks, she sat on her cot and stared at the wall. Hilda tried to speak to her. Inga offered water. Greta didn't respond. She couldn't respond. Everything inside her had gone quiet and cold and dead. The second wave arrived 3 days later during mail call. Greta's name was called along with maybe 20 others. She approached the distribution table with trembling hands and accepted a thin envelope with her sister's handwriting on it. She'd written 3 letters to Anna since her capture and received no response. Now, finally, this. She waited until evening to open it. Waited until the barracks was quiet and most of the women had gone to dinner. She sat on her cot with the letter in her lap for 10 full minutes before finding the courage to unfold the single page. The words blurred. She had to read them twice, then 3 times, before they made any kind of sense. Cologne was 90% rubble. Their mother had died in a bombing raid in October 1944, more than a year ago. Their father was missing, presumed dead in Soviet-controlled territory. Anna herself was living in a cellar with 2 other families, surviving on rations that barely kept them alive. Soviet soldiers were pushing west. Women were not safe. There was no work, no food, no future. The final paragraph said, "Don't come home, Greta. There's nothing left here. No apartment, no neighbors, no city worth calling a city. You're better off where you are. At least the Americans feed you. At least you're not starving. Stay there if they'll let you. There's nothing here but ghosts and rubble." Greta folded the letter carefully, precisely, along its original creases. She set it on the mattress beside her, lined up exactly parallel to the edge. Then she lay down, turned to face the wall, and stopped existing in any meaningful sense. Her body continued its functions. Her heart beat. Her lungs expanded and contracted. But everything that made her Greta, everything that constituted a person with thoughts and feelings and a will to survive, simply shut down. She went through the motions for days, woke when told to wake, ate when food was placed in front of her, went to the library and reshelved books with mechanical precision, spoke to no one, acknowledged no one. Even Lisa, who'd been released from isolation and was sullen and defiant, avoided her. "She's already dead," Lisa muttered to another woman in German. "Just doesn't know it yet." Ruth found her on the 5th evening, sitting alone during recreation hour, while everyone else gathered in small groups to talk or play cards or write letters. Ruth pulled up a chair and sat without asking permission. The silence stretched for a long time before either of them spoke. "You got a letter," Ruth finally said. It wasn't a question. Greta said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on a point on the wall that held no particular interest but required no thought to focus on. "Hoffmann, Greta, talk to me." The words came out in German, barely audible, ground out through a throat that felt like it was closing. "Warum? Why? Why are you kind to us? We destroyed everything. My family is dead. My city is gone. My country built death factories. I helped. I believed. I worked at my station, and I knew something was wrong, and I didn't ask questions because I didn't want to know. Why don't you just hate us? It would be so much easier if you just hated us." Ruth was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough, raw with emotion she wasn't trying to hide anymore. "You want to know why? Fine. I'll tell you why. My brother Tommy died on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. He was 22 years old. He wrote me a letter before D-Day. I still have it. Read it about once a week. He said, "Ruthie, we're not doing this for revenge. We're not doing this because we hate Germans. We're doing this so it stops, so their kids don't have to do this to our kids someday. So maybe, God willing, this is the last time." Her voice cracked. She stopped, swallowed hard, pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I do hate you sometimes," she continued. "I hate what you stood for. I hate that Tommy's dead and you're alive. I hate that I have to be professional and kind when all I want to do is scream at you that my little brother, my baby brother who used to catch fireflies and was afraid of thunderstorms, died liberating your country from itself." She lowered her hands, her eyes red but dry. "But if I torture you, if I starve you, if I become what you were, then Tommy died for nothing. Then we're just in a cycle, forever. Revenge breeding revenge until there's nobody left. So yeah, it's easier to hate. It's so much easier to hate. But easier doesn't rebuild the world. Easier doesn't stop the cycle. Easier doesn't honor the dead." She stood abruptly, wiped her eyes roughly with the back of her hand, and walked away without another word, leaving Greta alone in the gathering dusk. That night, Greta lay on her cot holding her sister's letter, reading it again and again by the dim light that came through the window. The barracks was clean and warm and safe. She was fed, she was clothed. She was protected by the very people she had helped try to destroy. And she had never, in her entire life, felt more lost or more alone or more deserving of every terrible thing that could possibly happen to her. How did you live when everything you were, everything you believed, had turned to ash? How did you wake up in the morning when your mother was dead and your city was rubble and your people had built factories for murdering children? How did you deserve to eat breakfast when millions hadn't even had that chance? She didn't have answers, but she kept breathing anyway, because apparently that's what bodies did even when minds gave up. February passed in a grey fog that seemed to permeate everything. Greta moved through the camp like a ghost, present but not truly alive. She worked in the library because she was told to work in the library. She ate her meals because refusing to eat would cause problems. She returned to her bunk each night and lay in the dark staring at nothing until sleep came or didn't come, and either way time passed and morning eventually arrived and she had to start the whole process over again. The other women gave her space, unsure how to bridge the distance she'd built around herself. Even Hilda, who had attached herself to Greta like a lost puppy in those early weeks, kept her distance now. You couldn't help someone who didn't want to be helped. You couldn't reach someone who'd already decided they didn't deserve saving. Ruth was assigned to psychiatric watch duty. 3 suicide attempts had occurred across different POW facilities in the past month, and Command had implemented new protocols requiring guards to do regular wellness checks on prisoners showing signs of severe depression or suicidal ideation. Ruth began sitting with Greta during recreation hour every evening, not speaking, not trying to force conversation, just present. A silent vigil. Days passed. A week. 2 weeks. Greta barely noticed. Time had lost its meaning. Then, one evening in late February, when the snow was beginning to melt and the air had that particular quality that suggested spring might eventually come, Greta spoke. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, rough and uncertain. "Do you think we can ever be forgiven? For what we did, for what we allowed, for what we didn't stop?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "I don't know," she said finally. "Not by everyone. Probably not by most people. Maybe not by anyone, honestly. Some things are too big to forgive. Then what's the point? What's the point of surviving if there's no redemption, no way back, nothing but carrying this guilt forever?" Ruth leaned forward, elbows resting on her knees, hands clasped between them. "The point," she said slowly, carefully, like she was working out the answer as she spoke, "is that you're not dead. Your sister's not dead. There are people still alive who need help, cities that need rebuilding, children who'll need teachers, fields that need planting. And maybe you don't get forgiven. Maybe you don't get redemption. Maybe you spend the rest of your life carrying what you did and what you didn't do. But maybe you also get to do better. Isn't that something? Isn't that worth surviving for?" Greta had no answer. But the question lodged itself somewhere deep inside, a splinter she couldn't quite dislodge, sharp and painful, but also somehow necessary. Evidence that she could still feel things. Evidence that she was still, despite everything, alive. March brought the thaw in more ways than one. Snow melted into thick mud that covered everything. The days grew perceptibly longer, and Greta, slowly, painfully, began to surface from the dark place she'd been drowning in since January. She started writing letters to Anna, not about the past, which was too painful to examine, not about the present, which was too complicated to explain, but about the future, tentative and uncertain as it was. Small things at first, observations about daily life that contained no emotional weight. The food here is plain but sufficient. Oatmeal most mornings, sometimes powdered eggs. Bread every day, usually with margarine. Then, as the weeks progressed and Anna wrote back with her own careful, guarded letters, Greta began to write about possibilities. "When you come here, and I will sponsor you, I promise, you'll eat oranges. Real ones. I've seen them in the magazines, bright as summer, sweet as candy, impossible and real at the same time." She wrote about learning English with Lou Martinez, who teased her accent mercilessly but never cruelly, who made her repeat phrases until the sounds felt natural in her mouth. "Maybe I can teach someday. Children need teachers, especially now. Especially children who'll be growing up in whatever comes next." She wrote, "We'll rebuild. Not Germany as it was, that Germany is dead and good riddance to it, but something different. Something honest, something that admits what happened and tries to do better. It sounds impossible, but what else is there?" Ruth began sharing more of her own family's story during their quiet hours in the library. Her grandparents had fled Prussian poverty in 1889 with nothing but a trunk full of linens and a prayer book, and desperate hope for something better. They'd built a bakery in a small town in Iowa, raised 3 children who spoke German at home and English everywhere else, survived the suspicion and occasional hostility of neighbors during the First War. Tommy, the youngest, had been born American but died liberating the country his grandparents had fled. The circle was complete in the cruelest possible way. "We're all refugees from something," Ruth said one afternoon while they reshelved books side by side in the small library. "War, poverty, bad choices. Our own worst selves, sometimes. The question isn't where you came from or what you fled. The question is what you build next. What you do with the fact that you survived when others didn't." The words settled over Greta like a benediction she didn't deserve but couldn't quite reject either. What you build next. As if building were still possible. As if there were still materials to work with. Still foundations that hadn't crumbled. Still blueprints worth following. In late March, Colonel Hayes made an announcement during morning assembly. Prisoners could now volunteer to participate in war relief efforts. The work would involve sewing clothes for displaced persons, packaging supplies for distribution, preparing materials for shipment to camps holding refugees throughout Europe. The colonel's voice was firm and clear. This is entirely voluntary. No one will be punished for refusing. No one will be rewarded for participating. The work is simply available for those who wish to do it. Some women refused immediately. Lisa was among them, her contempt radiating like heat. "I won't help mongrels and traitors and Jews," she announced loud enough for everyone to hear. "I won't participate in the victors' charity." But Greta raised her hand before she could talk herself out of it. "Who receives the supplies?" she asked. "Which people?" Colonel Hayes met her gaze directly. Everyone. Dutch children whose cities were flooded. Polish refugees walking west. French civilians returning to bombed towns. German families displaced by the fighting. Kids don't pick their nationality. They don't choose which side their parents fought on. They're just hungry and cold. Greta nodded slowly. "I'll help." The work was assigned to a large room in one of the administrative buildings, tables set up with sewing machines and supplies, fabric in various neutral colours, thread, scissors, patterns for simple garments. The work itself was straightforward. Cut fabric according to patterns, stitch seams, hem edges, fold finished garments and pack them into boxes marked for various destinations. The rhythm of needle moving through cloth became a kind of meditation, each stitch a small act of creation, each finished garment proof that something could still be made, still be useful, still serve a purpose beyond destruction. It wasn't redemption. Greta knew that. Sewing a few dozen shirts and pants and dresses wouldn't balance the scales, wouldn't undo the deaths, wouldn't rebuild the cities. But it was useful. And usefulness, she discovered, was a form of dignity she'd thought lost forever. She could still do something. She could still contribute something other than guilt and grief and paralyzing despair. Hilda joined the effort after a few days. Then Inga. Within 2 weeks, more than half the women in the barracks were involved in some capacity. The room filled with the quiet sounds of women working, conversations in German flowing naturally around shared tasks. For a few hours each day, they were not prisoners. They were seamstresses, workers, women making things that would keep children warm. It wasn't much, but it was something. And something, after months of nothing, felt like grace. April brought repatriation notices. Names were called at morning assembly. Women were told to prepare for transport home within the week. Some wept with joy, others wept with terror. What home? What Germany? What waited for them in the rubble of cities that no longer existed? Lisa Brandt was among the first group. She gathered her few belongings with stiff-backed pride, refusing to look at Greta or any of the others who had chosen to participate in the relief efforts. As she passed Greta's cot on her way out of the barracks for the last time, she paused. "Enjoy your American paradise, traitor. I hope you choke on their charity. I'll go home and find the others who still believe. We're not defeated. We're just waiting." Greta didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Lisa would return to Germany carrying her convictions like armor, uncracked and unbent and unchanged. She would search for a Reich that no longer existed and probably die still searching, still believing, still waiting for a victory that would never come. Greta felt a wave of pity so profound